After days of deadly Russian strikes, Trump finally called Putin crazy, his toughest words since the full-scale invasion began. But is it too late? And will he stay consistent? As US leadership fades, is Europe ready to carry the weight of supporting Ukraine, considering that Russia is once again amassing tens of thousands of troops on the border with Ukraine? We turn to Robert Patman, professor of international relations at the University of Otago in New Zealand, to unpack what's really driving global diplomacy and the deeper game behind today's negotiations. Mr. Patman, it's a pleasure to have you here in our studio for the first time, and I hope not for the last time.
Thank you.
So, back in your 2022 interview, you said that the global response to Russia's aggression was strong. But now, after over 3 years of brutal war and invasion, how would you rate it? Has the world done enough, or did key partners miss some critical steps?
When I made that comment in 2022, I had the impression that Mr. Biden, the then US president, was prepared not only to help Ukraine defend itself and stay alongside Ukraine's position, but also help Ukraine defeat Mr. Putin's attempted annexation of the country. And that didn't really pan out. It seemed to be that the Americans under Mr. Biden wanted to do enough to keep Ukraine in the war and being competitive against Russia, but it was quite reluctant to give Ukraine the sort of weaponry that so that Ukraine could take the war to Russia's backyard. And I think there was considerable frustration on the Ukrainian side. For example, Ukraine only got F-16s after a number of years, and there were other categories of weapons whereby there was a feeling that, that the West could have done more. There was a fear, I think, of provoking Putin. Mr. Putin made nuclear threats. And I think there has been a measured support for Ukraine. I thought back in 2022 that the Biden administration, once Ukraine had demonstrated its resolve, would try to help Ukraine complete the job and eject Russian troops out of Ukraine. Whereas I think the position taken by the Biden administration was much more measured.
Okay, I'm just opening the Washington Post right now, and I see the title "Trump softens on Putin as Russia's military edge weakens," officials say. So the thing is, why he cannot push on Russia? This is the moment. This is the right moment to push. And from your perspective, I mean, why the Trump's administration not doing that? This is the time, because Russia is really quite weak this time on the front line. Because, when we say, this 3 nights was crazy for Ukraine, especially for Ukrainian capital. And we know that when they are attacking so hard with drones and rockets, we know there is something wrong on the front line, that they are weak there. So if they are weak there, why they're not using this opportunity?
Well, Mr. Trump's relationship with Mr. Putin's always been a bit mysterious. And he said he would solve the problem within 24 hours when he was on the campaign trail. Remember his promise? Mr. Trump was going to bring peace to Ukraine within 24 hours. Unfortunately, that promise has not materialized. But Mr. Trump's peace plan seems to make a lot of concessions to Mr. Putin's demands. Mr. Trump expected Ukraine to give up virtually all the territories which have been partially or wholly annexed by the Russian invasion, as well as Crimea, as well as denying Ukraine's sovereign right to join NATO. So I think what the relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin, it is not easy to read, but I think President Zelensky has been patient and takes the view that it's important to engage with the Trump administration. And there are signs that the Trump administration, at least Mr. Trump says, is getting impatient, and in response to the appalling missile and drone attacks on Kyiv and other Ukrainian centres over the last 2 days or so, Mr. Trump was quoted as saying that he would have to seriously consider extended sanctions. The other key thing here is, though, however, that I think the Europeans do not share Mr. Trump's understanding of what a peace settlement looks like. And what we are witnessing, I think, is the Europeans seemed to be getting much more organised. Germany, for example, under the new leader, Friedrich Merz, is committing itself to spend 5% of GDP on defence, and Merz has made some quite forward-sounding noises. His rhetoric has included he wants Ukraine to go on the front foot in the conflict with Russia. That can only happen with much more European support.
But is the world risking its soft power by bending to Putin?
Well, I think Mr. Trump is facing a political dilemma. For some reason, he wants to have a close geopolitical relationship with Mr. Putin. Some of the Trump supporters say, that's due to the fact that the Trump administration wants to confront China and wants to peel or separate Russia from China. The counter-argument to that is that China will not separate itself from Russia, or Russia will not separate itself from China, because it depends heavily on China to keep sustaining this invasion. And the danger for Mr. Trump, there's two dangers here with his softly approach to Trump. Firstly, it will embolden China, which detect what they see as American weakness. The most powerful country in the world is quite happy, seems to be prepared to make territorial concessions to a country which has broken international law and basically ripped up the UN Charter by illegally invading a neighbour. But the second danger for Mr. Trump is that public opinion in the United States, opinion polls show that most Americans, over 80% of Americans, see Mr. Putin as America's enemy, not President Zelensky. And by keeping America engaged, President Zelensky may be calculating that public opinion in the United States, which is heavily in his favour, will have an effect on the administration.
Oh, yeah, I hope for that. But going back to sanctions, are the current international sanctions, not only American, actually working? I've heard from one expert, he said, well, let's imagine Putin has $100 for the war. Now he has $50 with the sanctions. I mean, do you share that assessment? Is that really true? And is that enough?
I think the sanctions are working. They're working more gradually and more slowly than many people appreciated when the sanctions were launched. But I do think there's a significant development in the pipeline. There is a bipartisan piece of legislation being promoted by Richard Blumenthal from the Democrats and Lindsey Graham from the Republicans. And this is a bill which has apparently got the support of more than at least 81 senators, which will, unless Russia backs down and embraces constructive peace negotiations, there is a proposal to introduce this sanctions bill in which countries like India and China will face quite substantial sanctions. In other words, Russia will find that two of its major partners will find themselves penalised for buying Russian oil, and such is the scale of these penalties. Some have said up to 500%. If this legislation is passed and it has bipartisan support in the Senate, this could significantly increase the cost of the conflict, the cost of the invasion for Putin's regime.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm waiting for the decision of the Senate, actually. Really hope that they will, make a right choice.
Well, Mr. Putin is in danger of playing into the hands of those senators who want this legislation, because his continued bombing of Ukraine, particularly its intensified missile and drone attacks in the last 3 days, will only strengthen the hand of people like Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, who say that Mr. Putin is not seriously interested in any peaceful settlement, and that he simply wants annexation of Ukraine, and he's stalling for time. And this legislation will be, from their point of view, will be necessary to put real pressure on Mr. Putin and particularly the Russian economy.
Yes. And, NATO still officially says Ukraine is not a member, so no direct military involvement. But over time, we hear more about NATO trainers, air defense systems in Ukraine, and even the idea of Western troops with this, coalition of the willing. Is NATO's position changing in practice? What do you think? And what could that mean for the war and Europe's future security?
Well, I think most NATO countries, I was in Germany and in the Netherlands in January for professional reasons. I was speaking at several universities in those countries. And the thing that really struck me was that, unlike the Trump administration, that many people I spoke to were resigned to the fact that Mr. Putin had to be faced down, he had to be confronted, and that any settlement that rewarded Putin's aggression in Ukraine would only invite further expansion by Putin's Russia. So I do think that in NATO, some of the key NATO members have quite a different understanding of Mr. Putin's motivations in Ukraine than from the Trump administration. It may be, thanks to public pressure in the United States, that the Trump administration begins to converge with the perceptions of countries like the German government, the British government, and the French government. But I do think that many European countries believe that what's happening in Ukraine has major implications, not only for Europe, but beyond Europe, certainly for the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, and in a recent interview, Ukraine's former foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, he said it might even help Ukraine if the U.S. steps away from the talks, negotiation process, because Washington has sometimes helped the Kremlin without meaning to. I mean, the current Trump's administration. Do you agree with that? And what role should Ukraine play in future talks with Russia? Do we need someone like, well, you mentioned Germany. Could they be that mediator in this process?
I think basically on paper, if Europe has the political will, if you put together countries like Poland, Germany, the UK, Sweden, Finland, France, these countries have a formidable military capability, more than enough to match the Russians. And the question is whether they can build a consensus. I think that is in. I think it was Ursula von der Leyen, the German EU chief, recently said that the West, as we know it, is finished. And I think she was referring to the split between the Trump administration and Europe's stance towards Ukraine. Now, of course, we do know there is not complete consensus within Europe. Countries like Hungary, pretty pro-Putin under Viktor Orban, and also Slovakia. But I think the vast majority of countries in Europe do see the Ukraine conflict as their conflict, that Ukraine is fighting on their behalf. And I think there's been a belated recognition also that Europe cannot necessarily depend on the Trump administration in the way that it did on the previous administration in Washington, the Biden administration. And that in turn that incentivizes the Europeans to strengthen their own military capability. So in a sense, we're witnessing a major transition in international relations that the Europeans who've lacked self-confidence, sometimes you had the feeling in the first 2 or 3 years of the Russian invasion of Ukraine that the Europeans were always waiting to get support from Washington if they were, in order to give them the green light to support Ukraine. So I think that stage may be over, but it's certainly, a very precarious situation. And it's important, I think, that there is now more leadership from Europe, because I think that in turn would impress, or at least send a signal to Mr. Putin that his costs of pursuing this conflict, this invasion of Ukraine, will increase over time.
Yes. And Russia keeps saying, like during the latest meeting in Istanbul, that peace talks don't mean they will stop bombing Ukraine. Well, is this it's definitely not a manipulation, because they're bombing us every night and every day. But why does the Kremlin keep showing up for talks at all? Why do they need that? Just to save time?
Well, it may be buying time. Also, the Kremlin may be confident that Mr. Trump is something of a sympathetic partner, and they may see him as even an ally. After all, I think Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and even Dmitry Peskov, the Russian spokesperson, said that following a 2-hour conversation between Trump and Putin recently, that Mr. Trump, they regarded Mr. Trump as someone who understood the Russian position and was neutral on the dispute between Ukraine and Russia. So maybe that's given Russia a false sense of confidence, and maybe they are underestimating the impact that public opinion could have in the US. It seems to me that Mr. Putin hasn't got too much wiggle room or room for maneuver when it comes to peace negotiations. He launched what he called a special military operation, basically to annex the whole of Ukraine. He has suffered appalling casualties. His army, the Russian army, has suffered appalling casualties. The Institute for the Study of War has estimated Russian casualties to be in excess of 700,000, and that's probably a conservative figure. And so Mr. Putin is in a difficult position. If he enters peace negotiations, there is always, the possibility he will be forced to compromise. So that's the suspicion, that he's stalling for time and doesn't want substantive conversations because he might have to compromise. I think Mr. Putin links his own political fate with those negotiations. Unless he can get the capitulation of Ukraine, which is, in my view, completely unrealistic. I don't think Ukrainians are going to give in to Russia's demands. But I think from his point of view, anything less than a significant demonstration that he's won this war, I think his political position in the Kremlin could become problematic. We saw in 2023, 2 years ago, Yevgeny Prigozhin launched what turned out to be a failed coup against Mr. Putin's regime. But again, it shows you the domestic risk that Mr. Putin faces. And I think he's very worried. And I think that may explain part of his stalling with regard to these peace negotiations. Just to recap, both President Zelensky and President Trump, and it was President Trump's idea, I think, asked for a 30-day ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire. And the president of Ukraine, the president of the United States agreed to that, but Mr. Putin wouldn't agree to it, except he wanted to have some negotiations in Istanbul and sent, as we know, a very low-level negotiating team. It seems to me perhaps Mr. Putin is stalling for time, but there may be other motivations. There may be a sense that the longer this goes on, he can weaken Western resolve. And he may be hoping for a breakthrough on the battlefront. that seems unlikely, but he's in a, I think often people depict Putin as winning this conflict. I don't see it in that way. I don't think time is on Mr. Putin's side, but he may believe it is.
You know what I was impressed from the talks in Istanbul, when Medinsky, he said, not only the thing he said, we are ready to fight for 1, 3 more years or even 20, how we did with Sweden, but what I was impressed with, he said, well, with the war in Ukraine, with Ukraine, is like Russians killing Russians. So, he's not even, people just telling into your face that they are not even accepting your existence. They are denying your existence. They think that they are fighting against Russians. Or I've heard another quote that Ukrainians are brainwashed Russians. You know how nonsense. And the thing is, they truly believe in that. They are sitting in Istanbul and saying, oh, it's just, this is how it is. It shocks me.
But that explains that example you've just taught, you've just outlined from the Istanbul negotiations outlines, I think, the heart of the catastrophic miscalculation by Putin by launching this invasion. He clearly believed that his army would quickly overwhelm Ukraine and that Ukraine would adjust to this new reality. Well, I know Mr. Putin said that he was simply reclaiming what was Russian land, but in fact, the evidence suggests otherwise because 43 million Ukrainians obviously disagree with him. And another thing that we have to keep in account here is that a lot of the Russian decision-making is occurring in a bit of an echo chamber. Mr. Putin has ruthlessly dealt with political opponents, and therefore much of his key advisors, indeed many of the politicians active in the current Russian scene, largely support Putin's views. And so there is a danger here, and I think it's occurred, of disastrous miscalculation. Mr. Putin's view of what's happening in Ukraine, certainly at the beginning of the war, was actually quite divorced from reality. And it seems to me there is still a danger of this happening. We shouldn't assume that the longer this war goes on, it's going to work in Russia's favor. We have plenty of examples in recent history of smaller countries defeating much bigger ones. America was the most powerful country in the world, and it got beaten in Vietnam. America didn't prevail in Iraq when it invaded that country in 2003. And then, of course, in between those events, we had the defeat of the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So there is no inevitable logic that Russia is going to overwhelm Ukraine. And the longer this war goes on, and given the shocking level of casualties, both sides have suffered terribly. And I don't want to minimize Ukrainian casualties, which have been terrible, but the scale of the Russian casualties is also appalling. And even an authoritarian regime needs to demonstrate it's making progress. So it may be that Mr. Putin faces renewed domestic pressures in the not too distant future.
And you believe that Russia may collapse in the visible future?
Very difficult. My crystal ball is no better than anyone else's. I think if that legislation goes through, the legislation being driven by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, this bipartisan legislation, if they start imposing serious sanctions on countries trading with Mr. Putin, given that Russia's dependence on the export of oil and gas, that could have a major effect on Russia's ability to sustain this invasion. And at the end of the day, whatever Mr. Putin's vision of the future is, if it is disconnected to the material capabilities at Russia's disposal, then Mr. Putin will have to adjust to that reality, or someone else will have to do it on behalf of Russia. So the stakes are considerable. Mr. Putin, in my view, will not survive a defeat in Ukraine or even a negotiated settlement where he has to substantially relinquish the territories he's illegally seized. And also China has taken a big risk supporting this illegal invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. Speaking about China, how serious we should consider this alliance between Russia and China. And also, there was a recent visit to Beijing recent visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow. What's the role of China in this?
I think China's role is critical. Technically, it's neutral, but it provides economic support and it provides military support. It provides dual-use technology, which is helping the Russian war machine. And so, again, China's role is pretty important, as is the role of India. Both India and China have bought Russian oil at discount prices. If that oil is not available at discount prices in the near future or medium-term future, that could change. What it seems to be. So I think yes, the Chinese role is important, but this is a multi-sided or multifaceted situation. Xi Jinping has taken a big political risk supporting Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There is, as I mentioned earlier, one bonus is that with the Trump administration in Washington, that may embolden China, particularly the Indo-Pacific region, may embolden China towards Taiwan and the Pacific Island nations. But there's another side to this equation, and that is if Mr. Putin finds himself losing the war, that is that the Europe gets its act together and starts giving President Zelensky's government the sort of military capability it needs, that could be very serious for the Chinese leadership, because Mr. Putin has undermined several key principles of Chinese foreign policy by invading Ukraine. For a long time, China has made its claim to Taiwan and indeed its sovereignty over Hong Kong contingent on the notion of territorial integrity and state sovereignty. China traditionally has placed great store in those two principles. Mr. Putin has undermined those principles, and if Putin is defeated, I think the consequences will not be confined to Moscow. Not only will Mr. Putin likely be overthrown if he loses in Ukraine, but also I think the consequences will be felt in Beijing, because I think even with a one-party state in China, we cannot assume everybody supported Xi Jinping's decision to effectively, tacitly support the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so what we could see, if in the event of a Putin defeat, is Xi Jinping's political position in Beijing much weakened.
Yeah, I was surprised when I saw him on the parade on the 8th of May and 9th of May, because the previous years, lots of allies of Russia even, they were not going to Moscow because, then people will see you as a person, as a leader who supports this war. But in 2025, this impunity of Putin, it's just like it gives a lot of leaders a green light to, just to come, and no one will be punished for that. No one will judge you seriously.
Yeah, but I think there is a danger that both the Russian and the Chinese leadership believe their own propaganda sometimes. For a long time, the narrative coming out of Moscow and Beijing is that the West is declining. And the US position in the post-9/11 world has relatively declined. But, talking about the Europeans, the crucial thing here is political will. And should they have the political will, I think that they step up their support for Ukraine, then I think there's no reason why Ukraine will be defeated. I mean, ultimately, it's easier for Russia to withdraw from this invasion of Ukraine than that is for Ukraine to give up in this war. I mean, I don't get any sense, however much suffering Ukrainians have undergone following the Russian invasion, that they want to give up, because they know that Russia will try to extend its authoritarian system to Ukraine. So, yeah, I mean, there are lots of leaders who express solidarity with Mr. Putin. I would say lots. There's about 20 or so, but I think they will readjust their position if they believe that Mr. Putin starts losing significantly in this conflict with Ukraine.
But also Russia is pushing the idea that the Soviet Union's collapse was illegal. That what I've heard from the recent times. How dangerous is that narrative? Could it become an excuse for more wars, not only against Ukraine, but other former Soviet states too, or maybe some other countries?
I think it's a very dangerous narrative, because it indirectly provides a rationale, a reason to expand beyond Ukraine. For example, just imagine that Mr. Trump got a settlement. I'm not saying he will, but just imagine he got a settlement in which Russia's aggression in Ukraine was rewarded. He was able to keep 20% of the territories which he has partially or wholly annexed. Should that happen, if Russia still saw itself as a dissatisfied power, which in Mr. Putin's gone on record as saying this, he believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest geopolitical catastrophes of the 20th century. The problem with this narrative that the collapse of the Soviet Union was illegal is that it casts into doubt the independence and the sovereignty of all those countries which have emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and also in Eastern Europe have gone on to join NATO and inject sovereignty into their foreign policy, something they were not able to do when the Soviet Union existed. So, yes, I do think it's a worrying narrative. Is it realistic? I don't think so. But it struck me as significant that when Mr. Putin recently appointed, I think it was General Medvedev, Medvedev indicated in an interview that the invasion of Ukraine was just the beginning of an expansionist agenda in Eastern Europe. Now, whether he was just saying that for rhetorical reasons or even morale-boosting reasons, I'm not sure. But I think this whole narrative that the collapse of the Soviet Union was illegal, it has implications which are expansionist in nature, and I think that's quite worrying. Whether Russia can actually, if it can't, it's showing no signs of being able to overwhelm Ukraine. So this might be just what I call a pipe dream about recreating the Soviet Union. I don't think it's possible. And I think certainly if Russia moves beyond Ukraine, it will probably meet NATO's resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard one of the international media saying that it is possible, just only in case if they will stop war in Ukraine and will go to Moldova, for instance. I don't know, because they, but on its own, I really don't believe they can do that on its own. Maybe with the help of China, which is unreal. So I hope it's unreal, actually.
Well, I think it struck me that when Mr. Putin has been saber rattling over nuclear weapons,
yeah,
he's occasionally made threats, hasn't he? If anybody helps Ukraine too much, they might face nuclear weapons, or Ukraine might face nuclear weapons. It was quite interesting that China has said on at least one occasion, nuclear weapons must not be used under any circumstances during the conflict in Ukraine. So I don't think we should see China and Russia's interests as identical. I think China regards Russia as a junior partner, and China is quite a non-sentimental view of international relations. If Xi Jinping believes that Mr. Trump is no longer of much use to China's foreign policy, then I don't think he would necessarily hang around and support Mr. Putin if it looks like Mr. Putin is not going to prevail in Ukraine.
Professor Patman, thank you so much for such a deep conversation, and I hope to see you
Thank you
again in our studio.
Thank you very much.